Have you ever had that feeling where you wake up and suddenly it seems like the entire world is freaking out about something you hadn't even heard of yesterday? Well, that's the power of what we call a moral panic. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this fear machine. We're going to build a toolkit so you can spot media hysteria when it happens and really understand how it shapes our culture. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start with something you probably remember, the so-called Tide Pod Challenge. It was everywhere, right? It just exploded online. And the story we were all told was pretty straightforward. Reckless teenagers are poisoning themselves for social media clicks. It felt like a really scary, really dangerous trend. But here's the question we always have to ask. Was that the real story?
And this is where it gets really interesting. Now, let's be super clear. Eating those pods is incredibly dangerous, no question. But when you actually dig into the data, the tragic deaths weren't from teens doing a challenge. They were heartbreaking accidents involving very young children and elderly folks with dementia. So that huge viral wave of fear about a teenage craze, the evidence just wasn't there. And that gap, the one between what we're terrified of and what's actually happening, that's the heart of a moral panic.
So yeah, that whole phenomenon, the Tide Pod story, it has a name. It's called a moral panic. So let's get a proper definition so we can really understand how this whole fear machine gets built. The guy who coined the term was a sociologist named Stanley Cohen. Way back in the 60s, he was studying how the media was covering these clashes between youth groups. You might have heard of them, the mods and the rockers. And he noticed something fascinating. The media wasn't just reporting on what happened, they were amplifying it, they were exaggerating it, turning a few seaside scuffles into this huge, nationwide threat to the British way of life. Sound familiar? It's the same exact pattern, just a different decade.
And here's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Every single moral panic needs a villain. It needs a bad guy. Cohen called this the folk devil. This is the person or the group that gets all the blame. They're the scapegoat. They basically become a symbol for whatever deep-seated anxiety society's feeling at that moment. So in the Tide Pod panic, who was the folk devil? Yep, the reckless teenager.
Okay, so how do we get from one small incident to this massive, full-blown panic? Well, building on what Cohen started, other sociologists have broken it down into 5 key ingredients. You can think of this as like a recipe for hysteria.
What's awesome about this is that it gives us a checklist we can actually use. So let's run the Tide Pods through it. First, you get concern. The media creates a ton of anxiety. Check. Next, hostility. This us versus them thing starts to form against the folk devils, those crazy teens. Check. Then you get consensus. Pretty much everyone agrees this is a huge, serious problem. But here's the big one, the most important one, disproportionality. The reaction is just way, way bigger than the actual threat. And finally, volatility. The whole thing just explodes out of nowhere. And then, a few weeks later, poof, it's gone. The media's on to the next thing. This 5-step pattern is your secret weapon for spotting a moral panic in the wild.
All right, so we know what a panic looks like. We've got the recipe. But why do they even happen in the first place? You know, who lights the match? Well, there are basically 3 main theories about where these things come from. So first up, we've got the grassroots model. This idea is that the panic isn't some big conspiracy. It just bubbles up from the bottom. It comes from genuine anxieties that people already have. You know, maybe fears about new technology or economic stress or changing social norms. The panic just taps into a nerve that's already raw. The second theory is pretty much the complete opposite. It's called the elite engineered model. And this one argues that, yeah, it is a kind of conspiracy, that a panic is deliberately created from the top down by people in power, the ruling elite. Why? Well, maybe to distract everyone from a real problem, like a bad economy, or to justify passing new laws that give them more control.
And finally, we have the one that many scholars think is the most common, the interest group model. Now, this isn't about everybody, and it's not about the top elites. It's about groups in the middle. Think activists, professional organizations, religious groups, who have something to gain. They're sometimes called moral entrepreneurs, and they launch these moral crusades to push their own specific agenda, whether that's getting more funding, more public influence, or turning their moral code into the law of the land.
Now, it is so easy to think of this as just a modern social media thing, but moral panics have been with us for a very, very long time. The basic pattern is historical. The thing that's changed, though, the thing that's really different, is the technology that pours gasoline on the fire. Let's just do a quick run through history. In the 1950s, the folk devil was comic books, supposedly causing juvenile delinquency. In the 60s, it was those youth subcultures we talked about.
The 80s brought us the completely baseless satanic panic, this terrifying fear about abuse in daycare centers. And in the 90s, we had the super predator myth, which was this racialized panic targeting young, mostly black men. Do you see the pattern here? The folk devils are almost always new forms of media, young people, or marginalized groups. The target changes, but the fear machine keeps on churning.
And that, of course, brings us to right now. This quote really just nails it. On social media, moral panics feel like a daily occurrence. The cycle has accelerated like crazy. We've gone from something that might happen once a decade to something that feels like it's happening every single day.
So what's the big difference? Well, in the old days, panics were top-down. You had gatekeepers, newspaper editors, TV producers, politicians who decided what became a big story. But today, they're crowdsourced. There are no gatekeepers anymore. The only thing that decides if a story is important is virality. If it spreads, it's real, whether it's actually true or not. And that changes absolutely everything.
So what does this new online model look like? Well, you can think of it in 4 pretty simple steps. Step 1. Your social media feed is a limitless, endless scroll of potential threats. Step 2. You see a post getting tons of shares and likes. Your brain is wired to see that and think, whoa, this must be important. Step 3. That sheer virality makes the threat feel way more real and immediate than it probably is. And finally, step 4, the cycle ends with moral punishment. You know, the online dogpile, the outrage mob, that goes after whoever the folk devil of the day is.
Okay, so we've defined what a moral panic is, we've dissected it, we've traced it all the way into the digital age, but let's zoom out. Let's bring it all home. Why does any of this really matter? Why is understanding this such a core skill for living in the world today?
All right, so here's the toolkit we've built. These are the key takeaways. First, remember that panics are constructed. They are not objective reality. Second, they're like an X-ray of society. They show you what we're really afraid of underneath it all. Third, always look for who's being turned into the scapegoat. It's almost always a marginalized group. 4, and this is crucial, this stuff has real-world consequences. Bad laws get passed. People's lives can be ruined. And finally, number 5, being able to recognize this pattern isn't just some cool academic trick. It is a fundamental, essential skill for media literacy today.
And that's really the challenge I want to leave you with. Because this cycle is not stopping. Tomorrow or next week, a new threat will be identified, a new folk devil will be named, and a new panic will start to spread. But now, you have the tools to see it for what it is. The next time you see a story just exploding with outrage online, you can stop and ask yourself, is there concern? Is there hostility? And most importantly, is this reaction proportional to the actual threat? You'll be able to see the machine at work, and that right there is an incredibly powerful skill to have.